Thank you all for coming today, the second day of Marxism. This meeting is called Do British Workers Benefit from Imperialism in the Global South? Our speaker today is Choonara, who is the editor of the International Socialist Journal.
Welcome to Marxism if you've just arrived here. Congratulations to anyone who got any sleep last night. Very glad to see the back of Rishi Sunak, who I hear has just resigned. Looking forward to the next phase in the struggle against Starmer and the rest of the ruling class in Britain. I'm not going to talk any more about the election, but if you want to hear me talk about the election, you come to the meeting I'm doing tomorrow. Yes. Today, I'm going to be speaking about a very different but very important debate. And the stakes are extremely high in this debate, because if what I'm about to say is wrong, then the millions of British workers, and we are talking about millions of British workers, who have marched in the street in support of Palestine, in support of Gaza, are doing so in conditions of utter ignorance of their own material interests. In other words, they're marching against their interests. If what I'm saying is wrong, the interest of British workers lies in strengthening imperialism, which means strengthening Israel, supporting Israel, and supporting the hold of imperialism over the planet. So the stakes are extraordinarily high. I want to argue that that's not the case, and that there is in fact a strong material basis for solidarity between those people in Gaza, other oppressed people around the world, and the British working class. But I want to be clear from the outset what we are and aren't debating, because I don't want to have a silly discussion. There is no debate to be had about whether the average conditions of British workers are better or worse than Bangladeshi workers, or workers in Chad, or what have you. This is not the debate. There is no debate. Workers are infinitely poorer, more oppressed, and so on in the global south than they are in Britain and most of its counterparts in Western Europe, North America, and so on. There's simply no real debate around that question, and it's not what I want to discuss today. The debate is about whether there is a causal link between poverty and suffering in the global south and relative wealth of workers in the global north. Those are the terms of debate. And secondly, I'm going to have to use a lot of terminology that is very inexact. Global south is a case in point. Global south is a useless term to actually describe a vast swathe of the world in which most of the world's population live, certainly where my family come from historically, coming from an Indian background. And we have to understand there's enormous unevenness across the global south. It's a very complicated picture if you actually begin to break it down. Includes, for example, China having its own set of inter-imperialist relationships with large swathes of Africa, for example. And there are lots of complexities. There are Indian capitalists who exploit British workers. People may know there's a big dispute taking place at Tata Steel, which is headquartered in Mumbai, but employs British workers in Wales and other areas. So I'm massively oversimplifying when I talk about the global south. There are other meetings that will probably address that in more detail than I will, but that's a necessary simplification in order to make my arguments. Now, what I want to deal with are the two left-wing arguments that advocate against what I'm going to argue. I want to deal with the two main theoretical props of the notion that British workers and similar workers around the world benefit from oppression and imperialism in the global south. One of those props for that theory is what's known as the theory of the labour aristocracy. That's something I'm going to come back to a little bit later on. Before I deal with that, I want to deal with a whole family of theories that are broadly known as theories of dependency theory, sometimes coupled with theories of unequal exchange, and so on. And these represent, I think, the most sophisticated left economic analyses that seek to make this argument of a link between wealth among workers in the north and poverty and imperialism in the global south. Now, dependency theory is an extraordinarily complex family of theories. There isn't one version of dependency theory. And indeed, in my notes, rather unusually, I've got 3 or 4 pages of notes and then 8 pages of appendices where I've gone through every version of dependency theory. If you want to ask me about Emmanuel's theory of dependency or Frank's theory of dependency, you can, but these are very elaborate, complex debates which I'm going to have to simplify. So we talk about dependency theory, we're talking about, in their first form, a set of theories that develop in the post-war period, a lot of them from Latin American left-wing economists, usually left-wing nationalists, if we're honest about it, and reformist economists in Latin America, that seek to identify why large swathes of the global south have been trapped in economic backwardness and not been able to advance and join the club of rich nations. In other words, they were advocating strategies for development in a capitalist sense. How can we have national development of our economy? I want to focus not so more on these early theories, but the more radical Marxist influenced theories developed by a slightly later group of thinkers. Paul Baran is one of the key ones, along with Sweezy and people like that, Gunther Frank, Marini, a very important Latin American scholar, Arigiri Emmanuel, probably the most, in some ways the most well-known theorist, and Samir Amin, another very, very well-known theorist of dependency. And the central claim in dependency theory, to use their terminology, is that there's a core of industrial nations, including Britain, that seek to perpetuate the underdevelopment and benefit from the underdevelopment of a so-called periphery of nations, the poorer nations. Often, between the core and the periphery, a so-called semi-periphery, which shares some of the characteristics of both. Brazil and various other countries, China a bit later on, were seen as semi-peripheral within these frameworks. And the argument is that the resulting flows of wealth and these structures of imperialism both entrench the division between the core and periphery, impoverish people in the periphery, and enrich people in the core. It's a central argument. Now, I want to say again from the outset, there's nothing terribly controversial among the people in this room, wherever you stand on dependency theory, in saying that imperialism has ravaged areas of the world like Africa. There's no debate around this. You look at the impact of the slave trade, you look at the impact of colonialism, you look at the impact of imperialism today, you look at the kind of struggles that are taking place in West Africa today, and the way that imperialism is intervening in those struggles. There is no question that imperialism and colonialism are a central factor in the relative impoverishment of African states. This was no secret to Marx. Marx writes very passionately about this. There's a whole body of scholarship now disinterring Marx's writings on the so-called periphery. But he says very clearly in Capital, what's the phrase? Capital comes into the world dripping from head to toe, from every pore, with blood and dirt. What is he talking about here? Among other things, he's talking about the transatlantic slave trade. He's absolutely clear on this. One of Marx's central political arguments during his own career was support for the northern states in the American Civil War, precisely as part of this attempt to internationalise struggles against plantation slavery in America. He was absolutely excoriating against the slave trade and everything associated with colonialism and all the rest of it. There's no argument about that. The problem with dependency theory is it takes Marx's analysis of class division and it says that actually the components in this division are no longer classes but nation states. The rich nations play the role of the capitalist class, the poor nations in the periphery play the role of the working class, and in the more elaborate versions, the semi-periphery are the middle class. And therefore, exploitation ceases to be a relationship between classes, and it becomes a relationship between nation-states. And this is hugely problematic, both because it obscures the division within nation-states between classes, which exist in both the global north and the global south, and I'm going to argue obscures the mechanisms through which value flows throughout the capitalist system. So this is the problem that I have with dependency theory in all its various forms. When we talk about exploitation at the heart of capitalism, we're talking about a global and international relationship, but we're talking primarily about a relationship between classes, between capitalists and workers. We do not say there aren't other impoverished and oppressed groups, but that's a central dynamic that's reproduced by capitalism on a global scale. And because of that, if you look at the history of colonial plunder, if you look at the history of the slave trade, for example, to give an obvious example in the British context, it is absolutely true that the wealth of the emerging capitalist class was founded to quite a large extent on colonialism and slavery. That's absolutely right. That's what Marx talks about when he talks about capitalism emerging, dripping head to toe in blood and dirt. If you look at the British ruling class, almost every section of the capitalist class, the aristocracy, the royal family, every section of the state, MPs and so on, were contaminated by the slave trade, participated in it directly, indirectly, were enriched by it, had a stake in it, and so on. This is absolutely the case. Estimates vary about the role that the slave trade and colonialism played in the birth of capitalism, but a realistic estimate says that this gave a 25–30% boost to early capitalism in Britain. But it's not the source of the majority of wealth of early capitalist society in Britain. It's a large chunk of it. But right from the outset, capitalism in Britain, as it develops and industrialises, is able to reproduce itself largely through the internal relations of capitalism. And this is very important. When Marx talks about the processes that he calls them the primitive accumulation of capital, the processes that got capitalism moving in the first place, he includes slavery and colonialism. But he also includes within that dynamic things that were happening in Britain. Crucially, the expropriation of the peasantry, the seizure of the land by early capitalist farmers in alliance with the state, which both impoverished the peasantry, dispossessed them, deprived them of means of production, and drove them into cities, and made them dependent on a wage, and therefore made them dependent on conditions of existence in which they were exploited in early British factories and other industrial centres. So these same processes that were impoverishing Africa were also hammering the British working class, not to the same extent. I want to be clear, I'm not making an equation between people dragged out of Africa and shipped in horrible conditions to plantation slavery in America. That's not my point. My point is that the working class in Britain were also victims of the same set of processes, of this process of primitive accumulation. And indeed, as capitalism ages and develops, more and more it becomes centred on pumping wealth out of working class people in factories and early manufacturing sites in Britain. It becomes more and more central to developing the profits of capitalism. Now, when I talk about exploitation here, I want to be clear what I mean. I mean simply this, that when you enter into a wage relationship with a boss, with a capitalist, the amount of wealth that you generate as a worker far exceeds what you take home in your wage. Often exploitation is used in a much more loose, sort of moralistic sense to say, oh, your conditions of work are horrible or whatever. That's not what we mean. We mean simply that it's a source of pumping wealth out of people. And the central mechanism that capitalists have used to pump wealth out of the people below them is wage labour under capitalism. This becomes central to the dynamic of the capitalist system. And it's very important to say The profits that capitalism derives from this sit with the capitalist class. They're not the property of the British or the British nation state or the British population. You know, when I go to work, I don't get on my pay slip a line that says, well, this much came from the bosses and this much came from exploitation in the global south. But that's not how it works. Yeah? So we have to understand these class dynamics at the centre of it, which means that there was a central common interest between those people who rose up against British colonialism in the global south and workers in the global north. It underpins the struggles that Marx and Engels and other people were involved in to mobilise, for example, cotton mill workers in places like Lancashire who were suffering during the American Civil War because of the slowdown in the supplies of cotton, but nonetheless millions of them signed petitions in support of the slave rebellion that was taking place in America. There's a commonality of interest here. Now that doesn't mean that the degree of suffering is the same. Marx writes about workers being bound to capital by a chain. He says this is a golden chain that can get longer or shorter. The degree to which workers fight largely shapes the length of that golden chain, their capacity to struggle and wrest things from capital. But that's precisely a struggle against capital. It's a struggle against the force that is exploiting and oppressing people on a global scale. So there's a commonality of interest here. Okay. Now, as capitalism ages, it changes. And I'm going to very briefly make a point about the changing structure of imperialism here. Colonialism ended. Slavery, in the transatlantic slavery sense, ended. Why did it end? Transatlantic slavery ended predominantly, most importantly, through massive slave revolts that took place in Jamaica, Haiti, and so on, that broke the basis of the slave trade and so on. Colonialism, in a formal sense, didn't completely end. You know, you can look at Ireland, Palestine, and so on. But there was a wave of struggles that helped to end colonial rule in vast swathes of Africa and India and so on and so forth. But it wasn't simply the fact of people overthrowing colonial slavery. That was combined with other factors. One of the very important ones in post-war capitalism is the fact that America didn't have large numbers of formal colonies, and therefore it wanted to create a form of capitalism in which it could go into these formal colonies and sell goods and so on. So America had an interest in dismantling formal colonies and replacing it with structures of imperialism and so on. But the third element here that's very important is, in relative terms, the global south became less important to capitalism. Became less central to how capitalists in countries like Britain or America or Japan derived their profits. If we look at the post-war period, and really this starts in the 1920s and 30s, the major powers seek to reduce their dependence on raw materials extracted from the global south, both by creating synthetic alternatives. I could go into the fertilizer industry and so on, but I'm not going to labour the point. By finding alternatives, increasing efficiency of their use. In the case of agricultural products, there's a massive expansion of agricultural output that actually happens in the global north in this period. So the global south is largely left to a state of malign neglect in this period. It's not as central to the development of the capitalist system at its core. Oil and gas, particularly oil in the post-war period, is the key exception to this. It's a very important exception. And this is why imperialism has been so focused on the Middle East and other oil-producing areas. But what you see from the 1970s onwards is gradually control of these oil resources shifting away from the so-called Seven Sisters, the Western oil majors, and back towards global south governments, if you want to call them that, although Saudi Arabia and so on, you're talking about a very, very wealthy and powerful state in the global south. What you've seen more recently is a further restructuring of capitalist relations, in which countries like China in particular, and China in many ways is exceptional in the degree to which it's become important to capitalism, have begun to become very, very important centres of manufacturing in their own right. It's actually something that dependency theory struggles with, because the logic of their argument is China is impossible. These states can't develop in this kind of way. Nonetheless, you've seen breakthroughs within the global south, whereas other parts of the global south, sub-Saharan Africa and so on, have been driven backwards in relative economic terms. Countries like China, on the other hand, have broken through and become a major part of this new international division of labour, if you want to call it that, and very important manufacturing hubs. Now, as part of this process, of course, the multinationals are very interested in what happens within China, but we need to make a couple of very important caveats. Number one, the people who derive their wealth from manufacturing in China are exclusively capitalists. And in this sense, the capitalists are extraordinarily egalitarian. They will exploit anyone, anywhere on the planet, if they can make a profit. That's the central logic of capitalism. They don't care what the colour of your skin is or your gender or anything else. From that point of view, they want to exploit you, they want to generate a profit. So of course, they're interested in participating in that process of capital exploiting Chinese workers. Secondly, it's very important to say that these peripheral countries, if you want to call them that, have their own domestic capitalist class that is extraordinarily developed today. If you look at China, anyone who's telling you there's not a capitalist class in China, really, what are you talking about? The level of inequality reflecting that class division is absolutely stark in that society. It is clearly not the case that sections of the Chinese ruling class are not benefiting from the exploitation of the mass of Chinese workers, and indeed the resistance of Chinese workers in recent years is testimony to the class division within that society. And thirdly, very importantly, the way in which, particularly interwar and post-war capitalism, capital became focused on certain areas of the globe above others has not fundamentally changed. China in many ways is an exception here, but if you look at where investment goes, and if you look at where profits are derived, and you look at flows of finance across the global system, they're still extraordinarily focused in very narrow areas of the world. Europe, North America, Japan, as I say, China is an exception. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it still does remain peripheral to the thinking of the most powerful sections of the ruling class on a global scale. And we have to understand that. Okay, already a bit over time. I just want to make a couple more points about recent writings about this, and then I want to turn to the labour aristocracy argument. The most recent writings that I think people should interrogate, debate and look at include a very interesting book by two friends of mine actually, Michael Roberts and Guglielmo Carcadi, looking at the role of value within the capitalist economy and restating the importance of value. I think it's a very good and interesting book. I think they're fundamentally wrong about the structure of imperialism. And that's not a secret, I say it as well, friends of mine. But what they're trying to do is that they want to make imperialism primarily an economic relationship, not what we would see a fusing together of economic and political interests in order to divide the world and then constantly redivide influence on a global scale. We have a completely different conception of imperialism. But as part of this argument, they want to accept an element of the dependency argument. They're quite critical about lots of dependency theory, but they want to make an argument that there are Marxist processes that allow the movement of value from south to north. Now there's two ways that they explore this. The first, which I think is completely unsuccessful, is an attempt to develop a Marxist theory of unequal exchange on a global scale. This is very technical, and I don't really want to... I'll give you the very short version. The logic of their argument is that capital flows from the global north to the global south. God, 5 minutes? I don't think that can be true. I will go more than 5 minutes, I'm afraid. Yeah. These flows of capital then depress prices in the global south and lead to a transfer of value. I don't think it's effective as a model because I don't think it takes into account theoretically the barriers to capital flow, or the fact that this process of capital flow that's supposed to equalise profit rates doesn't actually come to fruition if you look at the data. This is very technical. I will not say any more about that model, but people can ask me about it. The second thing is they do identify from mainstream economic data the flows of profit from south to north. It amounts to a total of 1% of GDP for the global north countries and about 1% of GDP for the global south countries. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm not saying there aren't flows of profits that flows into the pockets of capitalists in the global north, but this is not decisive either in the south or the north. It's not sufficient to explain in its entirety these kind of divisions and unevenness and development in the capitalist system. We need a better theory if we're to theorise that. Okay, I better move on to labour aristocracy because I'm going to run out of time otherwise. The second element within these arguments about British workers benefiting has a much more clear Marxist pedigree. The theory of the labour aristocracy, it's sort of floating around from the late 19th century. It's sort of mentioned here and there by people like Friedrich Engels and Marx to a lesser extent. It's picked up on, though, in particular by Lenin and Bukharin, one of his co-authors, and so on. And they mention it again and again, sort of in the early 1900s. But it's really a key point to which Lenin, in this book, Imperialism, the High Stage of Capital, very, very good book in lots of ways, very important to our own politics. But I think Lenin is wrong about his use of the concept of labour aristocracy in this book. I want to explain why Lenin turns to the theory of labour aristocracy. Because Lenin is trying to do two things. Number one, the First World War has just broken out. So he's trying to theorise imperialism, very importantly. Number two, he's trying to theorise why the major socialist organisations across Europe sided with their own national ruling class in the carve-up of the First World War. The equivalents of the Labour Party, which were a long way to the left of Keir Starmer's Labour Party, by the way, in 1914, backed their own ruling classes, particularly the SPD in Germany. There's lots of other examples. And so Lenin draws this theoretical link between imperialism on the one hand and the betrayals meted out by reformism on the other. And he says, well, maybe one explains the other. And that's Lenin's theory of the labour aristocracy. He's saying that there's a small section of the working class, a thin layer of the working class, who are bought off by the proceeds of imperialism, and that's why reformism predominates in the working classes in Europe. Now, I want to point out three central problems with this argument. The first is that Lenin's theory of the labour aristocracy, although I think it's completely wrong, is not the version that most people rely on in making these arguments that are associated with dependency theory. Because most people argue it's not a thin layer, it's the whole working class. It's very different to Lenin's argument. Lenin is saying this is about a small portion of the working class, but I have to say it makes it very hard to figure out in Lenin's writing which section of the working class and why. The argument changes at different points in Lenin's writing. It's quite complicated to trace. The second problem, which is more fundamental, if you look at the period in which Lenin was writing, who's leading the working class struggle in countries like Britain or Germany? Yes, sometimes poor, impoverished sections of the working class. Quite often, it's the engineers, it's the metal workers, it's the munitions workers during the war. These were often the wealthiest sections of the working class. If anyone's bought off by imperialism, it's these people who are leading strikes and factory occupations and bringing down the German government in 1918. It's not very compelling to say that these people are bought off by imperialism. They're central to the workers' struggles, which begin to undermine the slaughter of the First World War. We can say more about that in the discussion. Thirdly, and very importantly for us, it's a really bad explanation of reformism. Because you can see reformism developing in countries where there is no history of colonial plunder, where they're not major imperial powers, for all kinds of reasons. If you look at Egypt in the aftermath of the revolution, there were independent trade unions formed. Very rapidly, you got the rise of a trade union bureaucracy that saw its role as mediating between capital and labour and plays this very important reformist role. Reformism, I think we have to say, is a feature of working class consciousness as they radicalise that becomes crystallised in organisational form in any period in which capitalism can have a certain degree of stability. In that sense, Russia in the run to 1917 is a partial exception. I'm not saying Lenin didn't have to deal with reformism, he did, but the extent to which real reformist organisations crystallise out as mass forces inside the working class is quite limited in Russia in the run to 1917. We have to have better, more sophisticated analyses of reformism. Okay, I want to make 2 points to finish, if I may. The first is then, what is the reason why you have this uneven development of capitalism? And then I want to just say what the political conclusions are. Why do you have an uneven development of capitalism? Very simply, because capitalists will direct their capital to where they can derive the most profit. And within the history of capitalism, the centres of capitalist accumulation, where they've been able to derive the most profit, have tended to be, not without exceptions, but have tended to be those places where capital has already been directed. That's countries like Britain, America, and their counterparts around the world. Because here, if you want to exploit workers, you're talking about a layer of workers who are relatively healthy because of health services and so on, relatively well educated, operating in contexts with large amounts of fixed capital, large amounts of infrastructure already in place, huge urban centres, and it's a disciplined workforce who have generations of wage labour under their belt. And it turns out, if you're a capitalist and you can put your money anywhere in a factory, this historically has been the place in which you could derive most profit. And because of that, there's been a capacity of workers in these societies to fight for a bigger wage and to gain what Marx talked about as a moral and historical component of the wage based on class struggle and based on the capacity of capitalism to grant reforms. That's the reason for these intense differences. So there is exploitation everywhere under capitalism, but the degree to which suffering is distributed is not even across a capitalist system, and that reflects patterns of capitalist accumulation. And they're self-reinforcing patterns. Where you put your capital today, by and large, is where you put your capital tomorrow. That's why there are these huge divisions. Okay, what are the conclusions? I'll just give you the central one. We have a shared interest in fighting this rotten, barbaric, exploitative system. And anyone who thinks that British workers do benefit from oppression and imperialism in the global south, they're going to face two major political problems. First problem, how are you going to mobilise British workers as anything more than passive sort of moral observers to a revolution taking place elsewhere? You can't mobilise workers as internationalist revolutionaries and socialists unless you have some kind of conception where we have a shared interest with 2 or 3 billion workers in fighting this rotten system. Even more dangerously, if you're a revolutionary in the global south, what are you going to say to the people around you? We have a shared interest with our own ruling class in challenging ruling classes elsewhere. In other words, we should participate in this imperialist carve-up in the world and prioritise nation over class. That's a rotten politics, both in the global north and the global south. We have to go back to the finest traditions of Marxism and internationalism and say we have a shared interest in fighting this rotten system. I'll finish that.
Now, I've got a friend who claims he's a Marxist, and he will argue that the British working class is completely into imperialism, and it always will be. And one of his arguments is that after the war, when we were broke, we funded the National Health Service through the commodity stabilisation funds, which if you don't, I'm not sure if you know what they are, but the capitalists set them up for Africa, like for gold and groundnuts and cocoa. And they said we'll give a price, so you don't because commodity prices go up and down, so you won't lose out. We'll set the price and we'll set it in pounds, and we'll keep the money in the city. And so he says a lot of the money for the NHS come from those funds. We got it from there. And he said the other way they got the money was the Americans gave us a lot of money. And the reason they gave it to us was because we were putting down the insurgents in Asia. So really, the biggest thing that the states bought the working class off with was funded purely from imperialism.
I'm from the Netherlands, I'm with the comrades there, the International Socialists. I don't know how it is here in Britain, but we have a decent-sized Maoist kind of current in the Netherlands, and they have quite some influence, I would say, also on the Palestine movement. So arguments about, the kind of fund that really in the global north of the Netherlands or in the UK as well, we're fundamentally kind of like profiting from the exploitation of the global south, also of, for example, Zionism, the oppression of Palestinian people. That's quite common arguments, and one of the things, of course, is that it completely reduces the role of us here to the role of kind of allies or something like this. Really, it pacifies the struggle of the working class. It says that we have no stakes in it. You can find similar structures and patterns of arguments also in other forms of kind of privilege theory that come out of post-colonialism, for example. Also that there's a fundamental benefit for straight people in the exploitation of trans people, etc. And I think it's important that we're having these conversations as Marxists, that we learn the arguments. As for example, arguments about the labor aristocracy that Joseph brought up, and that explanation was really excellent. I think that we have to not avoid answering these questions, even if it puts us in difficult positions sometimes, because indeed it is. Otherwise, it is an incredibly demoralizing and pacifying position that's being taken by much of the movements. And what we need is, of course, Marxism that argues that we do have, even though there are petty privileges and small things that we, I guess, that we benefit from, that at a fundamental level, it is not in the interest of the working class as a whole that racism exists, or that imperialism exists, or that colonialism exists, and that actually we can win if we struggle together and fight together. Thanks.
I'm a German trade union activist, and I would like to share some impressions on that. I absolutely share your overall plea for showing the common interest, because it also strengthens us in our struggles. I'm a public service employee, so it strengthens us to say, look, it's about a common tendency of privatization. It's a global phenomenon, etc. So nurses can't say, look, we can't struggle because in other areas of the world the conditions in the hospitals are even worse, etc. So it is important to always look at the commonalities in the struggles, but I think it is a bit more complicated. I have lots of minor things to discuss, but I all ignore them now. I just want to, from the German perspective, the German regime of accumulation is absolutely depending on raw materials. It has a strong export orientation, so it is depending on imperialism. And it is not a small layer of the workers depending on this, for their reproduction and such. And also, the German capitalist state is depending on the taxes coming from this accumulation. So, and it depends on the class structures on the ground, how then this wealth is distributed. But if this accumulation is shrinking, there's less to distribute. So there's a bit more complicated than that. And necessarily in our struggles against austerity, we say tax the rich, the inequality is absolutely breathtakingly increasing it. So this is our focus. But nonetheless, well, the entire state is a capitalist state, so depending on this mode of the regime of accumulation. So, and it is a bit, we ignore it in our discourse, but as a public service employee, when we look at the heart of it, where the tax are coming from, it is from this, from this situation being situated in the global economy. So what do you think about that?
I think that the thing that the previous comrade raised is very important in this issue, because it comes down to, I think, what a lot of these things are about, which is actually about class versus nation in a lot of things. Because both the Maoist argument that was raised before and this argument start talking about we have to think as a class about the national cake, which is we have the money in this national cake because of taxes raised, because of what is done by our own ruling class. And one of the issues that going back to Marx's original arguments was precisely that we can't look at things in these terms, that workers have to look at things internationally. Marx started from workers of the world unite, you have nothing to do with your change, all this sort of thing. Now, it's not to say that the experience that we have of capitalism is not based on our own national borders, but it is to say that if workers try to fight back in terms of those borders, you will end up being isolated and divided, because you will end up having to say that you share interest with your own capitalists. And I don't think this applies simply to capitalists who are part of the main imperial powers. And the real thing that, this is, I think, the core of Joseph's argument, and I think one thing that he said at the beginning, I think is really important, is that the real difficulties of the whole concept of the global south. Because you can say there are the major powers, you can say there's the US, you can say there's Germany and France, you might say Britain, there's arguments about whether you'd say China now, but there's a whole series of other countries which we would now call sub-imperialisms, where actually many people are worse off, many people live in absolute poverty, and you have to, if we're talking about thinking about our nations depending on other, or exploiting other nations, I think it becomes very difficult to say where these countries fit in, where Egypt fits in, or Joseph mentioned Saudi Arabia, other countries like this, if you don't see them in terms of the class divisions within them. And I think that the problem of seeing things in the terms of people being bought off, I think if you go back to the last major upsurge in struggles, when you look in the 1970s, what was happening in Britain, when workers were rising up. If you look at the left in America, for instance, took up generally a different position, revolutionary there, from a Maoist politics, which was started out from a position of the working class here is thought of, we can't look to workers as people who will be in solidarity with people from around the world. And I think this desperately weakened their struggles when they were fighting back, and their ability to get the workers in the US to identify with and fight alongside workers from other places. So I suppose it's just as a general point, I think that saying that the money only exists because of what was done, because of imperialism, it's the only thing that gives capitalists the ability to pay for the NHS or other things. You can use that as an argument, but I think it's actually a weak argument because it undermines the ability of workers to fight back in the end. You've always got to rely on accepting what the capitalists say is the money that they have, rather than saying we have to reject this entire system, which is why there's always division between revolutionaries and reformists in my opinion.
Part of your critique was the shift of focus from class to nations within these theories, and I do agree with that. At the same time, I wonder if these power relations between nations and classes, if they have to exclude each other, what your stance is on that. You also hinted at many different theories of dependent. Oh my God, these words. Sorry. Existing, and I would love for you to go deeper into these different types of theories and which ideas you think one should maybe reject, which ones we can adapt to have a fuller understanding of imperialism on a global scale.
I just wanted to ask, if we come to Marxism for a few years, actually a few decades to be honest. So anyway, yeah, it's great to be here with the result of the Corbyn just got especially. But I just wanted to just say about the theory of super exploitation. I seem to remember going back, maybe 10 years ago or maybe a bit longer, but that was something we used to come into discussions and meetings about dependency theory. Then it was referred to as even the difficulties of the term global south and global north, third world development and so on, But I think it's a really important analysis of something that is taking place globally in capitalism today. And you absolutely point out, that the basis of surplus value is the difference there is between what the value of work it creates in a day, on a given period of time, and the value that they're remunerated, that they're given back through their wages. That's what Marx called the socially necessary labour time. Just enough money to get the work to go back to work, so to reproduce ourselves. Now it seems what's happening to me, I don't know, and to some other, much more very important theorists, you haven't mentioned, the names don't really matter, but who are arguing around the concept of super-exploitation, is that that's becoming much more generalised. And I'm interested in the garment industry in particular in Britain, and the way that actually what it does is it uses and takes advantage of the disgusting regime of racialisation of migrants to force workers who are partly documented and partly workers of colour, who are partly documented and undocumented in these disgusting capitalist racist terms, these racialised terms, and uses them as a means and forces them to work for actually less than an almost negligible amount that cannot possibly reproduce them in an adequate way. So wages have been forced down, the socially necessary labours on the value of that has been forced down. And it seems to me that theory of super-exploitation is quite useful to explain what's happening in sweating within the garment trade, right here in Britain. And I think that does also point to the inadequacy of the global north-south polarisation. Because of that theory of combined and uneven development, we're now seeing workers in this country generally, why do we have food banks being paid so low that the socially necessary labour time, the value of their labour as a commodity has been forced so low, it isn't just about relative value and absolute value as a means of exploitation, but so low that they have to go effectively, unfortunately and disgustingly fed from the state. I just wonder what your thoughts were on the theory of super-exploitation and how useful that is to us today.
I'd like to draw on what the comrade from the Netherlands also said. I'm from Germany, I'm Helena from Revolutionäre Linke, and in Germany right now, specifically if we focus on the Palestine Solidarity protests, this similar narrative is very prevalent, that it's not only the German working class and the white, specifically German working class, that is benefiting off of the genocide in Palestine, but that they're complicit in it. And this is widespread within the Palestine Solidarity movement because there is objectively, the demonstrations are being dominated by Palestinians, Muslim migrants, people of color, and that's why from this defeatist position that not enough white people are joining the demonstrations, the position comes, okay, these people are complicit in the genocide and we can forget about them. But if we look at polls, recent polls that have been conducted in Germany, up to 70% of people in Germany, of which the majority are working class, are not do not agree with the steps that the Israeli army is taking in Gaza. So there's a majority that are against what Israel is doing, that are against the German complicity in the genocide in Palestine, but who remain silent. And why do they remain silent? And that's where the function of racism comes. That in German media, there's been for 9 months a vicious hate and smear campaign being propagated by the media 24/7 that tells people those who go to the streets are terrorists. They want to destroy everything, they're Islamists, and so forth. So that's what's hindering people from going to the streets. But we have to remember, if 70% of the German population says that what is happening is wrong, that means they're not being convinced by that propaganda. So it has to be our duty to nevertheless mobilize that working class, because they're the only ones who can physically stop what's going on. They can physically stop the support of the genocide in Gaza by the German state, which is the second biggest weapons delivery to Israel. So what I'd like to just drive home is that that is our duty, as difficult as it is to mobilize those parts of the working class because they're being convinced by racist ideology. It's the only thing we can do.
Just another thing that following on from what people have mentioned about super-exploitation.
Can you use the microphone?
Following on what people have said about super-exploitation, one of the difficulties, I think, with dependency theorists is that they look at it chiefly from the view of capital and wealth accumulation, and less from the view of labour itself. Now, people have made this point, but actually in the global supply of labour, there's a contradictory thing going on. The conditions of imperialism allow Western capitalism to take advantage of that, but at the same time, it creates truly an international dimension to otherwise very white British working class. So today in the national, people mentioned about the National Health Service, you know, it is run by people who are brown and black and so on. And in fact, although there may be super exploitation, it's also the case that capitalism needs these people. And so it isn't all about super exploitation, it's exploitation alongside white workers. And therefore, the German comrade talks about the racism, and of course that is a dimension, and we in Ireland have seen very much that in the demonstrations on Palestine, it's those people who are working in the hospitals who are coming out, who are black and brown coming out on the demonstrations. But equally, workers have been affected by this. And this is an example of showing how this internationalism can come and affect us and white workers in a way that is hugely progressive. And therefore, to talk of a labour aristocracy in that context, suddenly the real internationalisation of workers comes into play. And I just think that sometimes the dependency theorists just look at it from an instrumental view of capital rather than how the other side of that, which is how labour itself has a defining role in this thing.
I was just struck by when Joseph was talking about the slave trade and like arguments, these various arguments that workers in developed countries benefit from the exploitation of the global south. Where I've kind of encountered people saying things like this, they're often not going through like these worked out economic theories which do exist and which Joseph has argued against. They're often kind of being influenced by this idea that's become very popular with the growth of identity politics, which is that sort of suffering is a source of moral authority, and that therefore people in the global south are far more exploited. And then when you look to take for example Britain, like there was Labour governments that were very much continuing British imperialism. So therefore, white workers just must not have the capacity to like resist imperialism in this way. But I think that like this doesn't reflect. Obviously, it doesn't reflect reality because we don't agree with that theory. But there's another thing that falsifies it, which is that like Ireland is now firmly a part of like the global north. It's a tax haven. It is like a hub of capital. However, like, are we now in the category of workers in developed countries that like have no inclination towards resistance, or like did the colonialism and exploitation of Ireland, like the primitive accumulation of like the land of Ireland, like did that ever happen? So I think that that's one thing that I suppose it's a spanner in the works for this theory.
Yeah, thanks for a very measured and serious discussion, which you don't always get a measured and serious discussion, so it's really good that in Marxism we can actually have that over what's quite an emotive topic, really, for a lot of people. I think it's, you know, it's an argument we have to continue developing. I want to make a few points. I'll start with something quite general. Someone asked, well, you know, does putting an emphasis on class exclude talking about tensions between nation states? Can't you have both? And what can we learn from dependency theory? I think this is a very good question. And let me deal with what we learn from dependency theory. I'm extraordinarily critical of all of the versions of dependency theory. At the same time, I can't but admire the fact that they've tried to theorise value on an international scale. And I do think that's a really important project. If, like me, you're a Marxist political economist, you do have to be able to explain the complexity of value as it plays out on the global terrain. I think that the answers that dependency theories give to this question are without exception wrong. But I do cherish the fact that they pose the question, and too many Marxists from my tradition haven't even asked that question. And it's an important one. So we do have to engage with these debates in a much more serious way. I'd say it's one of the big underdeveloped areas of Marxist political economy, really, is to theorise this in a serious way. Secondly, when I talk about imperialism, what I mean is the growing together of economic and geopolitical competition. So the growing together of competition between capitals and the economic terrain, and the competition between capitalist nation states as capitals begin to agglomerate and cluster around their nation states, as these capitalist states seek to divide the world either through formal colonisation or informal spheres of influence. And as these different capitalist powers develop unevenly and they clash and seek to redivide the world through military, economic and political means. So I have a theory of imperialism that encompasses both the contest between nation states and the competition of capital, but founded on a notion of capitalist competition and capitalist exploitation that insists that exploitation is always a relationship between classes. So that's my conception of imperialism. Now, within that structure of imperialism, we should be clear, we're not talking about a binary in which you have capitalist states over here and you have some sort of semi-feudal state over there, the colonies or whatever. That's not how capitalism works in 2024. What you have is a hierarchy of capitalist states, each of which feels compelled, if you're part of the ruling class in that state, to operate through a logic of capitalist development, which means exploitation, accumulation, and competition, everything that's associated with it. Some states are very successful and powerful. America, slightly below them, you have China and France, Britain, Germany, and so on. And then you have a hierarchy reaching right down to the least powerful capitalist states. But they all aspire to join the club of states at the top and to follow this capitalist logic. So the struggles are taking place within this context. Do the capitalist class benefit from imperialism? In the broad sense, absolutely they do. That's why they practice imperialism. But the benefits are often more complex than you think. I remember in the 2003 war in Iraq, lots of people on the left say, oh, the Americans are going to go in and they're plundering Iraqi oil wealth, and this is going to lead to a massive enrichment of America. It's not really what happened, and it wasn't really the logic of the American ruling class. It wasn't, we're going to go in and steal all the Iraqi oil. It was, we're going to say to the Chinese, if you want to get the Iraqi oil, you have to come to terms with American imperialism. So it's all caught up in this great power competition at the top of the capitalist system that then impacts on everything down below. So it's a complex and elaborated system. Now, if you're a successful capitalist imperialist power, it's quite likely that the conditions exist for working class people to wrest reforms from that system without having to make a revolution and break the state. So the capacity to win reforms can certainly increase, but you're winning reforms in this antagonistic context of class antagonism. And we have to remember that in order to win these reforms, you're fighting against the people who are perpetuating imperialism and ultimately are the beneficiaries of global capitalist development and imperialism. And that's the logic of the system. Now, we can see Germany within that context. Does Germany depend on raw materials? Of course, any manufacturing process is going to rely on extracting raw materials. How are these raw materials extracted? Generally, through capitalist means, exploiting wage labour, largely in the global south, although not exclusively in the global south. The beneficiaries of that process of exploitation in the extraction of raw materials are sections of the global capitalist ruling class, whether they're firms based in Germany or whether they're firms that are actually based in the global south itself, which is sometimes the case. So there are processes of exploitation all the way through this process, and there are processes of exploitation in German manufacturing. Very intense exploitation. We have to ask the question, why is so much capital pumped into manufacturing exports in Germany? Because it's massively profitable. Yes, the wages are higher, but the profits are astronomically higher in that context than you're going to get in a global south context for a similar manufacturing process, for example. So you can accept all that. There are processes of exploitation all the way along the value chain, so to speak. What I'm questioning is that there's a flow of wealth from the people who are exploited in the global south into the pockets of the people who are exploited in the global north. That's the argument here, not whether the ruling class benefit from imperialism or anything like that. Third point, just briefly on the origins of the welfare state in countries like Britain. I don't really accept the kind of argument your friend is putting. I'm not saying that there aren't forms of financial manipulation that ruling classes participate in. Of course, the big beneficiary from this at the moment is the US economy, because US debts are in dollars and the US government can print more dollars, and this helps to prevent America going bankrupt as it runs these massive deficits, and there's all kinds of financial manipulation as part of this, and there is a flow of wealth through what's called dollar seigniorage, and Britain participated in this in the past. That's all true, but that's not really how the welfare state was built. The welfare state was built both for exploitation of workers, both historical and all the workers who run the welfare state, and it was sustained through redistribution of wage income among the working class, along with taxation on capital. And yes, it's absolutely true, Britain, because it's a powerful imperialist state, could borrow absolutely tons of money throughout the Second World War and afterwards. And yes, it's absolutely true that America helped to fund the reconstruction of Europe after the war. Why did America do that? The same reason it wanted to deconstruct some of the, dismantle some of the colonial empires, because it thought it would create these massive markets for US-based multinationals if it did this. This was the logic of American imperialism in this phase. So we have to understand the different elements in these processes. And we should add to that, of course, the ruling class in Britain in 1945 were also a bit worried that there was going to be a revolution in Britain, because they saw what happened after World War I. So there's all these kind of constellation of forces that lead to the creation of the welfare state that don't rest and don't depend fundamentally on Britain putting down colonial rebellions. And you see lots of other countries that built a welfare state without the government putting down colonial rebellions. So it's not a compelling argument. Two points to finish on. Someone raised the question about super exploitation, and particularly garment workers. This is a subject very close to my heart because I live in Leicester. Leicester is the centre of the sweated trade in garments, largely involving paying often older Gujarati women who don't speak any English, £2 an hour or something like that to produce in sweatshop conditions. It's a transplantation of third world forms of production to the global north. That is super exploitation in the sense that you cannot reproduce a labourer through that process. But it's an exception in Britain, and we should understand that. It's not typical of labouring conditions in Britain. And it's not actually typical of what happens across the global south. Super exploitation does happen in the global south. But if it was true that most workers in the global south couldn't reproduce themselves, you'd have to ask, well, how are they reproducing themselves? I think the problem with theories of super exploitation, particularly from people like Marini, is they presuppose a singular standard for the wage on a global scale. It's fairly explicit if you read Marini's, or at least what's been translated from Marini into English, because that's how I have to read it, that he has this almost universal conception of the value of reproducing labour power. The fact is the value of reproducing labour power, for bad reasons, is very low in bits of the global south. And people live in squalid, horrifying conditions and have to reproduce themselves and live in those conditions. So there's massive oppression and inequality, but it's not true that the working class aren't reproducing themselves. So I don't see that as a process of super exploitation. I see that as regular capitalist exploitation compounded by horrible underdevelopment, squalor and oppression. Let me just end on this. The arguments about development and underdevelopment are really back on the agenda. And they're back on the agenda in part because of the rise of countries like China. Because what people sometimes identify in China is a path out of dependency and a model of capitalist development. And it gets to the core of one of the problems with dependency theory historically. Because by attributing blame for the suffering in the global south to workers in the global north, rather than a shared project of capital involving bosses in the global north, states in the global north, but also bosses in the global south and states and governments in the global south, it implies that there is a model of capitalist development that is somehow benign, non-exploitative, non-oppressive, and will bring liberation. Look at China. China has developed massively, but it's developed as a capitalist state with sharp, entrenched, and deepening class divisions. Where do we stand in that? We want to see the workers in China, as in any other country, rise up, and smash their own ruling class. And we have to say we're part of that shared international struggle, and as part of that process, we too have to smash our exploitative imperialist ruling class.